Our first reading today is from Matthew chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. When Jesus finished giving instructions to his 12 disciples, he left that place and went to teach and preach in towns near there. When John the Baptist heard in prison about the things Christ was doing, he sent some of his disciples to him. "Tell us," they asked Jesus, "are you the one John said was going to come, or should we wait for someone else?" Jesus answered, "Go back and tell John what you are hearing and seeing. The blind can see, the lame can walk. Those who suffer from dreaded skin diseases are made clean. The deaf can hear, the dead are brought back to life, and the good news is preached to the poor. Happy are those who take no offense at me."
So this morning we return to Matthew's Gospel. The past 3 weeks we have been in the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5, 6, and 7. This morning we're jumping ahead first to chapter 11 as we just heard, and then to chapter 13. Now the reading that Gary just shared with us highlights a change, a shift that happens in chapter 11. Jesus for many chapters has been focused on gathering his disciples together, on teaching and preaching both the disciples and the crowds who have gathered. He's sent disciples out on their own missions and received them back. But now we begin to hear the first rumblings of division and conflict. And as we heard in the story just a moment ago, even Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, has begun to wonder, is this really the one who is to come? Is Jesus really the Messiah? There's another theme, though, that's also at work here. We see it throughout the gospel. Matthew, in particular, highlights the theme of recognition, inviting us to recognize God's work in our midst. We heard it way back in chapter 2. You'll remember the story that's unique to Matthew about the Magi, the wise men who come. These foreigners from far away come and recognize Jesus as the Messiah. We hear it at the very end of the gospel in Matthew 25, those stories of the separating of the sheep and the goats. And so again and again, we're invited to ask here, do we see God at work in the places and people that are perhaps unlikely or unexpected to find God there? And we see that again this morning. So I want us to keep that theme in mind as we read from Matthew chapter 13 this morning. Now, chapter 13 is a whole set of different parables that Jesus tells. At the beginning of the chapter, he speaks about the sower, a sower who goes out and throws seeds on the many different types of soils. And that's one of the stories that's familiar to us. This morning's parable, though, is a little bit different. It has sower and it has seed, but there are two sowers, and the results are a little bit unexpected. So I invite us to listen again to God's word from Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then the enemy went away. So when the plants came up and they bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. Now the servants of the householder came to him and said, "Master, you sowed good seed in your field. Where then did these weeds come from?" And he answered them, "An enemy has done this." And his servants asked him, "Then do you want us to go and to pull them up and to gather the weeds?" But he replied, "No, for in gathering the weeds you would also uproot the wheat along with them. Instead, let them both grow together until the harvest. Then at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Growing up, I had a friend who ate food in a very particular way. At any meal, he always separated his food completely from one another. So there was no physical contact between any meat or potatoes or vegetables. They all had to be separated before he would eat them. Now, I always thought that he would have been well served by one of those plates that you give to young children that has the separate compartments in it. And in fact, I often wondered if maybe that was the source of this kind of behavior. I never did find out. But it did remind me that we as human beings often like to have very clear distinctions and dividing lines. We like to split things up neatly into easy-to-see divisions. You notice this if you've ever flown in an airplane and you look down. And you ever notice that all of the straight lines, whether it's roads or fences or fields that are marked up, all of those straight lines are always human-made. In contrast, God's creation is rarely found in a straight line. Instead, you find crooked and creeping lines all over the place, borders. Everywhere in God's creation, we see mixtures, wild mixtures of plants and trees and vegetation. Very rarely do we see those neat lines that divide us so often. There was an article in National Geographic a little while back about plant diversity. And it noted that in many ways in our modern times in the 21st century, we have come to rely on just a small handful of vegetables and fruits. And in the meantime, thousands of varieties have disappeared. In fact, it's estimated in the United States, this article said, that 90% of our historic fruit and vegetable varieties are no longer grown. One example is apples. There used to be over 7,000 different varieties of apples in the 19th century that are grown. But now fewer than 100 remain, and there's probably 5 or 6 or 10 that we have access to. Another example in this article came from China, where it said that 90% of the wheat varieties there that were cultivated just a half a century ago have completely disappeared. In fact, experts estimate that more than half of the world's food diversity has been gone now in the past half century. It's a reminder that God creates an abundant world of diversity. And often we humans move towards what's called a monoculture. And there's different reasons to do this, economic and efficient reasons. And yet sometimes it limits us in our world. I was reminded, too, of a picture that I have in my church office. It was taken way back in 1987. It's when Pat and I were first married. We were living in Germany. We had an opportunity to visit the city of Berlin when it was still a divided city. And the picture shows us standing in front of the Berlin Wall, which of course was built to separate the East from the West. It was a powerful symbol of division that we humans so often try to build. And yet, within 3 years, that wall had come down and had been destroyed. And so those clear lines that we so often want to build are difficult to maintain. The straight lines that we put up seem to often push against God's desire for something different. Now, I bring this up because our parable this morning in many ways is about nice, clear lines and distinctions. As we read the story, we have a farmer, a householder, who has gone out into his field to make it ready for planting. And it's a familiar scene as a backdrop for Jesus' teachings about what the kingdom of heaven is like. And we're told that the farmer goes out and sows with good seed. And so the sower is planting wheat. And wheat, of course, is an important crop. He's waiting for it to spring up so that it can be harvested. And then the seeds, of course, the harvest piece can be milled up and made into bread. It can feed the hungry women and men of the community. This is important work for nourishing the community. And so we're told the sower sows good and productive seed. And in many ways, it's a very pleasant and wonderful picture to see. But then, as so often happens in Jesus' parables, something unexpected happens. We're told that an enemy sneaks in under the cover of darkness while everyone is asleep. And the enemy comes and plants weeds there among the wheat. Now, what the enemy probably sowed is a seed called darnel. It's particularly harmful and dangerous because it looks exactly like wheat as it grows and matures. And it's only when it comes to harvest time that you can tell the difference. And it's difficult because the weeds are dangerous. They have toxins in them. So if your field is covered with these weeds along with the wheat, then the whole thing must be thrown away. And so it's a difficult task that has come up here in a dangerous situation. And so the parable continues. It says that the seeds are sown, they begin to sprout, of course, and they begin to grow. But after a while, the servants of the farmer, of the householder, begin to notice the difference. And they come to the master and say, "Master, there are weeds in the garden." The farmer explains, of course, that this was not the plan, that he had planted good and healthy and productive seeds, but someone, the enemy, had sowed the weeds among the wheat. And we see the servants are quite anxious to please their master. They're ready to set things right, to fix the problem that they have discovered. And they say, "We will go out and we'll weed the fields. We'll get rid of the dangerous weeds that are out there. We'll pull it up. We will, in essence, engage in a holy war against the evil weeds that have infested the land." Now, in some ways, it's difficult to argue against what the servants say. After all, a sensible farmer would want to have the weeds removed. No one wants to deal with them throughout the harvest. It's hard to argue against uprooting evil and providing for a good harvest and triumph. And yet we're surprised perhaps when the master responds, "No, don't go and do that. Leave the weeds in place and in peace," he says. "Let them grow together in the midst of our beautiful wheat field. Leave this blessed mixture of wheat and weeds to me." And he says, at the proper time, at the harvest, then I will make it right. And so what is going on here in this story? Why might Jesus be telling this to those who are gathered to listen to him? Well, I think the problem here and the difficulty is it's easy to fall into the trap of trying to solve and fix a problem that we come across, rather than trusting in God's Spirit to lead us through the journey. I think our temptation here maybe is to follow the ways of the world, to take some immediate action, to go out and to do something, instead of listening to Jesus and trying to learn the way of God's kingdom. I think it's interesting to notice in the parable that Jesus does not focus on the enemy, the one who sowed the weeds in the field. Jesus does not try to identify him. The master in the story doesn't go out and try to exact revenge or punishment. In fact, the enemy seems to even just leave the stage entirely as the farmer deals with the issue at hand. Instead, what the sower of the good seed does is he waits until the plants come to their maturity, because otherwise you're likely to mistake the weeds for the wheat. The roots have grown deep and they have intertwined. And as we said, if you start pulling up the weeds, the wheat themselves is also going to come up. Something terrible is going to happen and the whole harvest will be ruined. So it's interesting that instead of radical action taken immediately, instead of pulling up the weeds and destroying the wheat crop, the parable tells us to be patient. I think of the old word forbearance, and I think that fits well in this story. Because forbearance means patient self-control. It means having restraint, to hold back on that action, and to wait in God's timing to see what happens. Now, we note in the story that Jesus does not tell us to somehow confuse the evil and the good. He does not say that the weeds and the wheat are the same thing. But instead, he says, be patient. Don't immediately rip up what is bad by taking out the good as well. Let us wait for the right action that God's calling us to. And so what lessons might we learn from this? What lessons is Jesus teaching us? Well, first, I think we are invited to see here that the kingdom is at work in our midst. Because we too, of course, are something of a mixed bag. We are also a mix of weeds and wheat gathered together. And so just think about the images that Jesus is inviting us to see. Think of the mixture that we have in our own congregation. Think about the mixture of people you have in families and relationships, and how some of us seem to work well together, and other times there are issues that come up. Everyone has their strengths and their shortcomings. None of us is perfect. And so Jesus invites us to see that intertwining as part of our human life together. There's a wonderful quote from Martin Luther who said that each person, each individual, is simultaneously both a saint and a sinner. And I think we see that lived out here in the parable, that is what our nature is, and Jesus clearly recognizes it. The Russian writer and Nobel Prize winner Alexander Solzhenitsyn, as you probably know, spent many years in forced labor camps before he was eventually exiled from the Soviet Union. He, of course, witnessed many cruel acts and experienced harsh punishment of those who were trying to weed out the bad, supposedly among the good. Reflecting on these difficult experiences, he once wrote this. He said, "Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states and nations, nor through social classes, nor between different political parties, but rather the line is separated directly through every human heart. If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the dividing line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?" In many ways, the Apostle Paul makes the same argument, speaks the same truth in Romans chapter 7, where he says, "I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. But I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I so often do." And so the parable today, Jesus encourages us to be patient, to wait on God, to use forbearance, because separating weeds from the wheat is never that simple, just as life is never that simple. And people sometimes are much more complex than we want to give them credit for. The second part, I think, that Jesus is teaching us this morning in this parable is that he invites us to be unflinchingly realistic about the complexity of life. Yes, there is evil in the world, Jesus said, and yes, there are certainly weeds that grow among the wheat. There are unwanted weeds in gardens. There are destructive weeds in congregations and in communities. There are dangerous weeds in our own lives and relationships. That is a fact of human life. And yet Jesus cautions God is not finished with us yet. God is not finished with the world and with the church and with our relationships, that there is still hope for change to come. A few years back, Pope Francis spoke of this very issue when he said this. He said, "God is in every person's life, even if the life of a person has been a seeming disaster, even if that life has been destroyed by vices or drugs or anything else, God is in that person's life. And so you can and you must try to seek God in every human being. Although the life of a person is full of thorns and weeds, there is always a space in which good seed can grow. You always have to trust God is present there. This parable reminds us that loving the world and those who are in it is not always an easy task. It's tempting, is it not, to divide and to judge, to separate and to root out those that seem to be the problems among us. But this is not the way of God's kingdom, Jesus proclaims. Instead, our task is clear, that we are to go out into that blessed mix of wheat and weeds and to inhabit the world and trust that God is still at work in our midst, that God is not done with us or with the world. And so the Spirit is still active. The Spirit is still alive in our particular community here and in this time and place. God is still present here in us, who indeed are a mixture of weed and wheats, a mixture of saints and sinners in this place that we call home and church. And so my prayer for all of us this week is this, that we may celebrate this wonderful mixture of weeds and wheat that are God's creation, that we may forgive, that we may love each other just as Jesus loves us, and that we may share the amazing good news that God is present with us as we too make our way to the harvest. And so to God be all praise and honor and glory this day. Amen.